welcome Elizabeth Kolbert and Bradley Campbell for our final session. Bradley is the president of the Conservation Law Foundation. It's a Boston-based organization committed to protecting New England's environment for the benefit of all. Uses law and science and the market to create solutions that preserve our natural resources, build healthy communities, and sustain a vibrant economy. He's been at the forefront of shaping the country's most significant environmental policies and laws. He was a former White House senior appointee during the Clinton administration and previously launched a law firm with a focus on issues involving the environment and developed some of the largest net metered commercial solar projects in the US. So I will let Bradley kick us off and introduce Elizabeth. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, as someone who works for an environmental advocacy organization, and for whom climate change touches every aspect of our work, it's really my great pleasure and honor to be here with someone who is really the foremost chronicler of climate change and the state of the earth in this country. Elizabeth Kolbert has been a staff writer for the New Yorker since 1999. Her three-part series, The Climate of Man, in 2006, won the National Magazine Award for Public Interest. In 2010, she won the National Magazine Award for Reviews and Criticism. And in 2015, she won the Pulitzer Prize for The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History. She's also won the Blake Dodd Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Today, we're here to talk about Under a White Sky. It's her latest book, which looks at human intervention in the environment and how our efforts to fix some environmental problems beget even greater problems. And so in a summer where climate change has been screaming from the headlines on an island that's especially vulnerable to rising seas and more extreme weather, this is a terrific book that speaks to the moment we're in. It speaks to the island we're on. And so it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Under a White Sky reads like the third part of the trilogy after Field Notes from a Catastrophe and The Sixth Extinction. What led you from one to the other?
Well, definitely, there is a through line. The Field Notes, which is embarrassingly 15 years old already, and La Plus à Change, was a book about climate change that really, at a moment when I had this extremely, naive view that I was going to just lay out climate change for everyone and how important it was, and that was going to sort of settle this, debate, as it were. And things didn't work out that way, really, very well. But after that book came out, people sort of started to come to me, honestly, with stories that, like, well, you think that's bad. I mean, you think climate change is bad. For example, Jane Lubchenco, who's now in the White House, I was in touch with her, and that led to a piece on ocean acidification, which is sometimes called global warming's equally evil twin. And this whole idea of the Anthropocene was just sort of coming into vogue, I guess, or into the world, that we live on a sort of human-dominated planet. And that sort of got me on the path that led to the Sixth Extinction, which is also embarrassingly now several years old. And then after that book came out, I really honestly felt like I'd sort of written myself into a corner because, what story could be bigger than mass extinction? But, life does go on. I mean, people are grappling with these issues in all sorts of different, interesting, and in many ways alarming ways. And we're going to continue. And so that sort of seemed to me to be sort of the next step in this trilogy. Maybe it's a trilogy, maybe it's a quadrilogy, I'm not sure. Anyway, but that seemed sort of the logical, okay, where do we go from here? And where we go from here is very much, at the center of Under a White Sky. And you can read that. You can read it in many different ways, unfortunately.
Well, the book points out that where we go from here also should be informed by where we've been in the past. And I love your treating the river as a metaphor, in this case the Mississippi River, and laying out the cascading unintended consequences of various interventions to fix one environmental problem that then generates another environmental problem, and has left, for instance, flood control projects that have left the state of Louisiana losing an acre of land every 90 minutes. Tell us part of that story and how it kind of informs the larger narrative.
Yeah, so the story of southern Louisiana is sort of, in some ways a really, really, beautiful example of the phenomenon that I'm talking about in the book. And that story really begins in 1718 when the French decide to settle what's sometimes called, an impossible city and sometimes called an inevitable city, New Orleans, which sits, at the confluence where the Mississippi sort of hits the Gulf. Very strategically important, was going to become a strategically important spot. And the French settled it in 1718 and were immediately flooded out. I mean, the Mississippi floods, flooded virtually every spring. And their response was to start digging in and start putting up levees and start putting in drainage canals. And that is a project that has gone on for the last, 300 years. And here we are 300 years later. And what it has done, as people probably know, is really straitjacketed the Mississippi. The Mississippi built the delta upon which New Orleans sits, and that is constantly sinking. And unless you are replenishing it, and that's naturally sinking. So there are parts of southern Louisiana that should be disappearing, and parts of it that should be being built. But because of this straitjacketing of the Mississippi, we now shoot all of the sediment that the Mississippi carries, and it carries a lot less sediment than it used to because it's of dams on the Missouri, and we can go up there too. It gets shot off the Gulf of Mexico into very deep water now. So we're not building any land. Meanwhile, New Orleans is one of the fastest sinking places on Earth, so we keep having to build up these flood defenses. We just, after Katrina, spent billions of dollars to do that, but they're already not rated for a Category 5 storm because they've sunk so much in the intervening years, just since they were finished, so maybe 5 years ago. So this is this, sort of treadmill that we're on with southern Louisiana, and the book talks about a project to try to get, our hands around it, but it's extremely difficult. You cannot let, the Mississippi flood New Orleans. It's simply not politically viable. So they're going to try to build, and I'm pretty sure this will happen, they're going to build these huge, massive, what are called diversions. They're going to punch a hole in the levees south of New Orleans on both sides, both banks of the river, and when the river is very high, they'll open the gates, they'll let this sediment-laden water flow into these very shallow bays, and they hope that they will build water. But this is, I should add, a race against sea level rise. So the treadmill, which was bad enough without sea level rise, is now running faster and faster.
You then shift to what I think of as sort of the Corps of Engineers and manipulating rivers as being kind of old school manipulation of the environment. You then shift to what are in some ways really heroic tales of scientists who are on the cutting edge trying to either to save species or to alter species to save other species. And one of the stories has to do with gene editing of cane toads in Australia. Tell a little bit about that story, because it's fascinating.
So the cane toad story is another just like, you can't make this stuff up sort of stories. And there's a great movie, which I will recommend. It came out in the 80s, actually, and it's up on YouTube. It's called Cane Toads and Unnatural History, and it's sort of this spoofy movie about cane toads in Australia. I really recommend it. It's a lot of fun about this, incredible ecological disaster, which is that they brought cane toads quite purposefully to Australia in the 1930s. They're these enormous toads that are basically native to Central America. They are called cane toads because they supposedly were going to eat sugarcane beetles that were destroying the sugarcane crop. They did nothing for that, of course. They just multiplied and spread, and they continue to expand their territory around coastal Australia. But in addition to being very large, they're very toxic, highly toxic. So a lot of Australia's native wildlife, eats these things, has no native, didn't co-evolve with them, just bites into them, dies. Your dogs bite into them, die. And so this project, which was fascinating, they had successfully gene-edited a group of toads to be less toxic. Now, that was a really, really interesting piece of science brought to you by CRISPR, which is really revolutionizing gene editing right now. And Walter Isaacson was here the other day, and his book is really about the invention of CRISPR. But it raises a lot of questions. I mean, there may be, hundreds of millions of cane toads on Australia already. The few that you could gene edit, would get engulfed by the already existing quite toxic population. So then you're sort of driven to the next generation of technology, which is what's called gene drive, where you could take a trait that you had engineered into a creature and you could push it out so that every child, every offspring, all the offspring, and cane toad's gonna have 30,000 offspring, would inherit this trait. And gene drive is sort of the next horizon of gene editing, extremely controversial and potentially extremely dangerous.
One of the great things about the book is that I think it's at least the first book of popular nonfiction that looks seriously at the interventions that are under development to save ourselves as a species by altering the climate system. And you take a pretty skeptical view of those and take a hard look at carbon removal in particular, and talk about what you think the threats and possibilities are of those technologies.
Well, so carbon dioxide removal, just, because it's not really sort of part yet of the public discourse that much, but it's very much part of climate discourse now, as you know, is this idea that, well, we've put so much carbon up there already that it's really not enough to just stop emitting carbon, and Lord knows we're not stopping. We're going to have to take it out of the atmosphere. And that is a wonderful idea. It's just that the thermodynamics of it are very difficult because we get energy when we burn fossil fuels and emit CO2, and to take CO2 out of the air requires energy. So where are we getting this energy from? If we're getting it by burning fossil fuels, we're once again, on this terrible treadmill. So people are coming up, are thinking about this, very seriously. There's a lot of VC going into it because the theory, at least according to theory, there's going to have to be a lot of money behind it. So there are all sorts of startups looking at how you could do this in a way that takes the least energy possible. Then you also have to do something with the CO2. What are you going to do with it? So I'll just give you an example. I visited a project in Iceland where they take the CO2 out of the air using chemicals. It will bind to fairly well-known chemicals. And then you heat the chemicals, you force off the CO2, and in Iceland, they're burying it in this volcanic rock where it actually reacts with the rock. It solidifies. So it's an amazingly cool project in a lot of ways, but then the question is, can you scale it? This is a tiny little pilot project.
Isn't there a risk that if we keep grasping for the silver bullet that's going to take carbon out of the air, or sort of the big engineering fix to climate, that it kind of lets us off the hook for doing the kinds of emissions reductions we need to do now?
Well, that is very much the worry, this sort of moral hazard argument. We shouldn't even be talking about things like this. We shouldn't be putting a lot of money into them because we're still emitting so much carbon. Let's just put all of our focus on not emitting carbon. And I think that's a very reasonable argument. But we're about to get, I'll give you a preview. We're about to get a new IPCC report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's going to be out on Monday, the first sort of working group. And I think it's going to be quite dire. And then from there, if you look into the future and say, how do we avoid meeting these climate thresholds that we've set for ourselves and that Lord knows we should try to avoid, it's very, very difficult to do it without carbon dioxide removal. So you're in this bind, and that's really, to be honest, what the book is about. We're in a bind. We've gotten ourselves in a jam. So you can say we shouldn't be doing this, but you do get forced to a position. We shouldn't be, focusing on this. We should be focusing on cutting carbon, but you pretty quickly get to the point, well, we actually need to do both. We already need to do both.
You're a little bit more skeptical of solar geoengineering, which is the technology that, from the book's title, could literally leave us under a white sky. What do you see as the greater peril there?
Well, so solar geoengineering, the idea behind solar geoengineering, which is sort of like the ultimate techno fix to all our problems, is that we would, we've dumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere, we heated up the planet. What can we do? Well, we can try to counteract that by putting reflective matter in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back to space, literally less direct sunlight hitting the Earth. And we know this works because it's what volcanoes do. So, that's pretty good proof of concept. After a big eruption, we get, a period of lower temperatures until those particles fall out of the stratosphere. But, you don't have to be, I don't think it takes, a rocket scientist to be concerned about what happens when you start talk about treadmills, this process of putting stuff into the stratosphere to cool the Earth. And as long as you're emitting carbon, you have to keep putting more and more. And that is, to some people, and I think quite reasonably, really the nightmare scenario. It's not like we haven't screwed things up enough. We have to, add a new layer of screwing things up. And it does get pretty scary. And there are a lot of people who say, we shouldn't be even talking about this or looking at it. And Harvard actually is really the center of research right now on this subject. But I feel pretty confident that we're going to just hear more and more about this because, once again, we've gotten ourselves into a pretty big jam up as this summer, you ain't seen nothing yet. Climate change has a big time lag in it. So, you might think this is bad, and but there's already a lot more damage built in. So there are a lot of people, including these people at Harvard, who are very, very smart scientists, who would say, well, we don't have the luxury of saying we're not going to look at this because, what are the alternatives? And that keeps coming up. What are the alternatives? It's not like there's a great alternative here.
You describe that attitude among scientists as, I think, techno-fatalism. And I'm wondering, have you come away from this as something of a techno-fatalist? Like, all our choices are lousy, but we still, for that very reason, we have to pursue these kinds of things.
Well, I think that, I'm of mixed minds. I don't feel like I, take a strong stand, and, some people were, pissed about that. But I think that both sides have a very legitimate argument to make. I think that as we see the state of our politics, a very compelling argument to be made. Well, you can't change the laws of geophysics. You can change politics. Let's change our politics. But then you look at our politics, which are so dysfunctional, and you say, can we, maybe we should change the laws of geophysics because, we're sure as hell not changing our politics. So you get in it's hard to know which is more unrealistic.
Yeah, and certainly the tale of the Corps of Engineers is a cautionary one because the Corps was essentially given carte blanche on the Mississippi for all practical purposes. And it brings up this issue of governance, whether these technologies can be governed. And is there a particular worry because some nations that are hit first and worst by climate change may decide to deploy some of these things before they're ready or before we even know everything about them?
Well, that I don't know if we have any sci-fi fans in the audience, but if anyone has read Kim Stanley Robinson's latest book, The Ministry for the Future, it begins with India, a terrible, terrible heat wave in India, and the Indians decide, for humanitarian reasons, to sort of unilaterally deploy geoengineering. That's how the book begins. It's a book of science fiction, I should point out. But that's where, Stan's imagination, took him. And I think it's a really interesting idea, and it's, you could add it to your list of worries. But I actually think of all the worries that we have, that is not high on my list, because geoengineering requires a huge fleet of aircraft blowing, reflective particles into the stratosphere. It's nothing you can do, in your backyard. And if you have an air force, if the US decided, or China decided, or Russia decided they didn't want this to happen, it would be pretty easy to make it not happen. Now, if the US decided they did want it to happen, and Russia decided, and China decided, then it would be potentially relatively easy to make it happen. So that is I don't think we have to worry about like the rogue billionaire doing it, but we do have to worry about the great powers doing it.
I'm not sure how reassuring that is, actually.
Well,
think
yes,
about
you
that
can
for a
choose your
minute.
call, yeah.
In terms of the institution, I found myself thinking as I was reading this, are there even wackier proposals for altering the climate that wound up on the cutting room floor as you wrote the book? And what were some of those?
Yeah, actually there were, although none, I do want to say none quite as consequential as altering the stratosphere, which is, pretty up there. But there's a whole group of people working, it's not necessarily wackier, but there's a lot of group of people working on what's called cloud brightening, which is you would spray salt particles into clouds, and you would make them whiter, and this would theoretically, also reflect sunlight back to space, but it would be on a more regional level, not on a global level. And there are some people who would argue that that is safer, but there are other people who would argue that that is not safer. It's even more dangerous, because if you change the climate in one place, you change it in another. This is just an interconnected system. So that is something that people could do, theoretically again, without any oversight, and just do. Once again, if the US Navy wanted to blow you out of the water, that probably wouldn't be very difficult. But these regional things of regional weather modification or climate modification, those could, once again, in theory, be done by one nation, but could have global repercussions.
These are all serious, dire topics, and I'm wondering, after 3 books that are covering, really consequential existential threats, how do you maintain a sense of, well, you seem to maintain a sense of humor. I don't know if you can maintain a sense of hope, but are you able to keep a sense of hope after immersing yourself in this?
Well, I think that the thing that's really important to acknowledge at this point is, there may not be any good choices, but there are worse choices. There are like bad choices and worse choices, and that our goal, in climate circles, as I'm sure you've heard this phrase, the goal is to manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. And, are we at the point where we can no longer even avoid the unmanageable? That's an open question. I think we have to act. Once again, it's sort of like, Pascal's wager. We have to act as if we can still do that and try to do that. But I do think we need to be honest and say that we have left the realm where everything's just going to work out.
Fair enough. But there are some, not to be Pollyannish, but we have the EU just making a whole new round of commitments on climate. We have we finally have a non-climate denier in the White House after 4 years of darkness. Any of that give you a sense of encouragement or optimism?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that, and optimism is a strong word, but I just got one of these climate newsletters in my email just before I came. This is our opportunity, our last opportunity until the next 10 years are up, to really do something serious on climate. And I think that this next, between now and the 2022 elections, when God knows what will happen, that is our last best hope, and we better, we better hope, and we better be working for the best. What will actually happen, I don't know. I'm depending on you for that, Brad.
Well, thank you for that. We certainly think there is reasons for optimism, although the headwinds are considerable. In New England, we have 5 of our 6 states now under enforceable declining carbon caps. So progress continued at the state and regional level, even under Trump, and at the subnational local level globally. But there's no question that the challenge is daunting. So I wonder, what do you hope people will take away? Do you see this book as a call to action for your readers to really get engaged in these issues? What do you ideally want your readers to take away from this?
Well, I think ideally I'd like them to take away, it's not really a how-to book, it's more like a how-not-to book. And it looks at a lot of, sort of follies of the past, and asks the question, I'd say the question is sort of, can we try to make better decisions going forward under really difficult circumstances? Think things through better. Now that's a big task, and I don't say like, okay, these are the 10 things we ought to do, but I think it makes the point that there's a lot of unintended consequences always, and those tend to be the ones that really come and bite us. And we need to be thinking really, really carefully about these techno fixes, which are the things that we tend to reach for. We do tend to reach for these fixes, and you're going to see this, I'm sure there are many Bostonians in here, you're going to see it in Boston, you're going to see, are we going to build something around the city to protect it? Because we are not in a situation where, we just want to retreat. And, on Martha's Vineyard, it's also going to be it's going to be a very interesting process to watch. What are we going to do with these forces that we have set in motion?
We already have multi-million-dollar houses being moved in retreat, major beach losses here in Martha's Vineyard. We're going to move to the question and answer session to make this a larger conversation. So please, if you have a question or comment, please move to the microphones that are in the aisles here and step up. Hello.
So I have not read your book yet, but
okay.
I have been reading some of Bill Gates's book about climate change. And so my question is, I live in a town next to the Pilgrim nuclear power plant and was just able to tour it and see where they're storing their spent fuel, and it's scary as hell. And one of the things that Bill Gates talks about is the importance of nuclear power going forward. I find that scary, but I don't know. I'm just wondering what your take is on that as a part of the solution to carbon dioxide.
That's a really good question, and you will find, very smart people like Bill Gates saying there's no way we can tackle this without nuclear, and you'll find very smart people saying there's no way we can tackle it with nuclear. Now, and I don't know what the answer is. I can only say, and you, by touring Pilgrim, you know that we've never even come close to solving the fundamental problem, or one of the fundamental problems, which is what to do with the spent fuel. All of the spent fuel from every nuclear power plant in the U.S. is sitting on the grounds of the nuclear power plant. And after September 11th, there was a brief surge of interest in this because it's still very hot, literally hot. It has to be kept cool. And if you could breach these tanks, which are a lot less protected than the containment vessels, you could cause some really serious problems. And that's one of the reasons I think that Indian Point, which is right next to New York City, is being shut down. So we are actually, whatever you actually think about this issue, and I think it is a very important one, we are actually closing nuclear plants. And that is one of the reasons I do want to say why we're having trouble. We do have to replace that power with power. And so that makes the hurdle for renewable, for solar, for wind, that much higher, because we're actually, the proportion of our power that's coming from nuclear is declining. So it's a really hard problem. We should be having this conversation. We should be having a conversation about a permanent repository, and we are not.
Yeah, and I would just add, just about every, pathway that's been defined to get to net zero emissions by 2050 in line with the Paris goals assumes a role for existing nuclear power plants, that some number of them will continue to be operated safely and continue, but but for 20, 30 years, advanced nuclear reactors have been 10 years away, and it just keeps moving further and further away. Same for solutions for the waste issue. And so I think for those of us who are sort of trying to focus on how we actually get there, what are the nuts and bolts of emissions reductions, I can't put the kind of faith Bill Gates does in that kind of sudden nuclear renaissance. Even with Obama's support, only a few nuclear plants were built, and all of those went into billion-dollar overruns. It's just not a technology that lends itself to being a solution in time to address the worst of climate change.
This is really a follow-on question. That said, and with all the cautions that Elizabeth put on the table, why do we still not have a flexible energy policy? I mean, are there clear scenarios laid out for different amounts of wind or solar, interim gas, nuclear? It seems like there's no grasp of the overall problem and clear directions with, bifurcations, if this happens, if that happens. Where is all that hiding?
I'm going to let you take that one, Brad.
I think to some extent it's hiding in plain sight, and to some extent your criticism is completely apt. I mean, we've had a system for 4 years we've had little or no federal leadership on making an energy transition that would take us through to decarbonization. What you have had is states and regions trying to fill in that gap. So here in Massachusetts, same now for Rhode Island, Vermont, and Maine, you have states that have actually said we are going to get to, in some cases, net zero, in other cases, 80% reductions by 2050. But they're only now beginning to lay out what that pathway is. Massachusetts just released sort of its first iteration of what that pathway looks like, and a lot of it depends on things that you're seeing happen around you right now. The major wind farm developments will be a major part of decarbonizing the grid in New England, and yet there's still, opposition. There's still skepticism as to whether they'll come online. But I think that we're beginning to see that work get done. The question is whether it'll get done and when it will get done. There's a great tendency of political leaders to, and we were joking about this actually last night, to make commitments that are to, not in my term of office. I'm going to make a really ambitious goal. We'll get to net zero by 2050, but it's really someone else's problem. And we're not just now getting to the point where, because of some laws that have been enacted and some leadership by the states, the pressure is now on to find out what those solutions are. But it's an incredibly complex question, and you still have you're doing this against the headwinds of a natural gas industry, fossil fuel industry that's still looking to expand rather than transition. So major headwinds. Yeah.
So an awful lot of this, to build on what you just said, comes down to political will, clearly. One frequently reads things like a majority of Americans now believe that climate change is significant and a significant threat. But if you ask them from a scale of 1 to 10, list their 10 top priorities, it typically comes in at number 10 or something like that. Things are getting worse every year, as we've all witnessed, this summer being a classic example. assuming that trends continue and assuming we keep doing about as much about climate change as we do now, or maybe we do more after the Monday report is released, but we're kind of on this trajectory. At some point, things will get, it seems to me, bad enough or disruptive enough, and weather-wise around the world, that we're going to see a significant call sooner or later for climate change to be taken seriously. It's going to rise up on that list of 10 priorities. How long do you think we have? How bad will things have to, I mean, this is what's your crystal ball, but how bad do things have to get before the political will begins to match the scale of the problem, and how long do you think that'll take?
Well, I mean, I have been sort of covering this issue now for, getting on to 20 years, and I would have thought, after Katrina, after this, after that, and now the fact that this summer, which I think has really, brought things home to a lot of people. Well, let me take a different tack. We have a problem called COVID, and there are a lot of people in the United States who are not getting vaccinated against COVID. Now, you would think, what could be more clear? There's a deadly disease that's very contagious, but it turns out that humanity's ability to not be influenced by even things that are directly affecting them is greater than you might have predicted pre-COVID. And so here we are in a summer which, as I say, has really 114 in Portland, Oregon or whatever, brought home to people, a lot of people, this is very dangerous, this is not going in a good direction. But here we are, and we have an infrastructure bill, and we have, we just don't have on the table what we need. We don't even really, we are having a political debate. I think there will be a political debate over a clean energy standard, for example, but it's not at all clear that we're going to get that in this year of really pretty dire news. So, your guess is as good as mine. How's that?
I think that's a great answer. There is a disconnect from what people seem to believe and what political leaders seem willing to do. I love the story of Obama being briefed by a science advisor and being told that a majority of people in red states and in the red districts of blue states believe climate change is real, that it's potentially catastrophic, and that man has a central role in it. Obama shakes his head, yeah, that's very interesting. And he said, in fact, more people in the red states and in the red districts of blue states believe that about climate change than believe in evolution. So, yeah, I'm not sure it's reassuring, but it is telling, at least. But I think what you're seeing more and more is action at the grassroots level that's hopefully bubbling up. And you do see more and more state leaders making commitments. As I said, in the 6 states of New England, all but one, which is New Hampshire and idiosyncratic, have made major commitments on climate. What they haven't done yet is really put in the regulatory hammers you need to force it. So, by way of recent example, as part of a settlement of a merger that arose from the gas explosions that many of you probably read about in Lawrence and Andover and North Andover in Massachusetts, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, put in a provision into the ultimate settlement that said, to National Grid, the gas company, you have to begin writing the plan that has you exit from natural gas. And that needs to be replicated in every state across other utilities. But it's at least a pretty encouraging sign that for the first time, in a coercive way, in a regulatory way, we're actually focusing, businesses whose business model depends on serving those audiences. They've got to begin that. Now, will that be a passing or ephemeral victory. I don't think so. I think that's going to begin to be followed elsewhere, and I think the companies themselves are beginning to recognize that they have to, if they are going to have a future, they're going to have to take those steps. Even Exxon is apologizing these days, which is, as a leading an organization that has multiple lawsuits against ExxonMobil. It's, even that I find encouraging. So there are those signs. Yeah, no, fair enough. Fair enough.
So you talked about regulatory hooks to accomplish change. Where are the insurance companies on this? Why aren't they looking at this? Why aren't they paying very close attention to their obligations or not?
Well, I don't have a good answer for that, and maybe I'll punch Brad again, but or maybe someone else in the audience. I mean, I think that one of the big issues that we have in this country is, for example, the federal flood insurance program, which is a very politicized program, and whenever someone tries to reform it to reflect actual costs, it goes nowhere because everyone is dependent on, a lot of coastal communities are dependent on it. But I do think that, and I should turn it over to people who are buying flood insurance here in Martha's Vineyard, which would be a classic example. I do think I'm going to venture that it's getting harder and harder. I think on the Cape it is getting harder and harder. But I should really ask people, is it getting more expensive? I don't
Well,
live here, so I don't
as you
know.
say, there was the transition to make it actuarial rates. When the first rate hit the insureds, there was a hue and cry, and Congress intervened and basically stopped the rate hikes. And so we are subsidizing disaster in that sense. But to the point that was made earlier about what is the really bad thing that's going to hit. And I think one of the things people don't realize is insurance policies are pretty much written on an annual basis. And what insurance companies say is, well, yeah, no, we see the problem with climate, but we write policies 1 year at a time. And I think we're going to reach that point where they're going to stop writing for those risks, and then you may see a change in the political, that may have some prompting of political will to actually begin to address these things. Or it may prompt more subsidies, or a combination. But I think that's one of the challenges with insurance. Yeah.
I guess I'm just looking for a little bit of optimism, maybe. But in all your reporting and research into this, what are the technologies that you think are maybe have promise and are underreported, and that you're watching as they make progress? Technologies or perhaps initiatives.
Well, I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount going on in the tech field, in terms of, for example, battery storage. That's a huge issue going forward. I think that there's a lot of people working on that, and I just recently read, and I don't know how credible it was, about some really interesting breakthroughs on that front. So I think that our technological abilities are, and that's sort of one of the themes of the book, are quite extraordinary. And that is, I mean, you could argue that what we're reaching for, even when we say, okay, well, let's transition our energy systems, which Lord knows, I applaud, is a techno fix. We're not saying, let's all live radically differently. Let's all not, you came to Martha's Vineyard, 300 years ago, and people used as much energy as they could get, out of their horse. And that was a very, very limited amount of energy, and you lived very differently. And now we use vastly more energy because we're digging it up out of the ground and, throwing it into the atmosphere. So, if you really believed, well, we were just going to have to solve this without technology, you would really despair. But as it is, we're incredibly clever. I mean, and I think the thing that people would point to as really the great advance of the last decade or so is how much solar has gone down in price. It really has changed the conversation. an energy transition that seemed really quixotic and economically, I don't want to say impossible, but very difficult, now does seem possible. It does seem possible to imagine, a carbon-free Massachusetts by 2050 because of rapidly developing technologies like the reduction in cost in solar panels. So those are reasons to be optimistic. Are those going to get us, optimistic? Are those going to get us where we need to go? I think we're going to need a lot of carrots and also, to be honest, a lot of sticks. I don't think we're getting there without the sticks.
Yeah, I think the sticks are important, but I do think there's been enough of a shift that you're seeing a lot of investment in new technologies. And I might add to my techno-optimism side the nuclear fusion, which doesn't present the issues of waste and safety that nuclear fission does. And it's a technology, I think, that's been 10 years away for all 40 years of my career. But there have actually been some incredible advances, and much of that work is being done here in Massachusetts because of superconducting materials. They actually may get to a cost-effective, commercially successful technology there before any more nuclear plants could ever be built, but we'll see. Richard Lazarus.
Yes. So one of the many wonderful things about your books, both Sixth Extinction and the latest one, Under the White Sky, is you don't just immerse yourself in the science, you actually immerse yourself with scientists. And you tell stories often about people. In this most recent book, are there any people that you came away with that you just really fell in love with or just were immensely impressed by them, not just as scientists, but just as human beings?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the book sort of really began, it's a story I tell in the middle of the book, with a scientist who very tragically died while I was writing the book, but a woman named Ruth Gates. And if any of you have seen a movie called Chasing Coral, she's a character in that movie. And she was working on this project, which may or may not be quixotic, to be honest, about trying to actually sort of breed up corals that could withstand warmer water temperatures. And she was very much, her attitude was sort of, well, you can look at this, glass as, 95% empty, or you can look at it as 5% full. And while I'm was somewhat skeptical of whether this was going to work, I was very, very impressed by her. She was a really charismatic person. And that's really where the book sort of began, that we do have to, acknowledge we are not living in a world, we're not going back to the coral reefs of the past. That's just unfortunately, tragically not happening. So what are we going to do? And that was really, sort of she inspired me to sort of think about that and think about that as the big question of our time and as a book. And so she's sort of at the center of the book, the way I see it. As I say, really, really tragically died very young at the age of 58 while I was writing the book, just when I was actually about to go talk to her again. So that's a sad story, but also, to me, she was a real inspiration.
I think we have time for one last question.
Is there any green technology that's going to help us in carbon sequestration? It seems like nature does the best job of pulling carbon out of the air, and we have like a CRISPR expert. Is anybody making trees that will grab more carbon, plankton, something that, I don't want to talk about an unintended algae bloom, but it seems like it would make more sense than just shoving carbon dioxide into rocks.
Well, I should say all of our carbon dioxide will eventually end up in rocks. So, that's sort of trying to speed up a natural process. Ditto with trying to get, plant life to suck up more carbon. It's sort of like the intermediary stage, I guess. But the answer is yes. People are working on, can we develop plants that store more carbon in their roots, for example, and then if you had sort of no-till agriculture and you left the root mass in the ground, you could, potentially store a lot of carbon that way. So, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, if you're still cutting down rainforest, if, you're in a losing battle, because there's, just so much carbon you can sequester in the soil. There's only so much carbon you can sequester in living biomass. If you're continuing to dig up, hundreds of millions of years worth of dead biomass in the form of fossil fuels. So that's the longer answer.
There is a lot of work being done on the extent to which regenerative agriculture and forestry practices can increase the sequestration of carbon in the soil. But the science on that is very tricky and much debated as to whether that's actually an effective way of sequestering carbon. I will mention there's also kind of a false climate solution that's touted, especially touted in New England, that burning biomass because of the cycle of sequestering carbon in wood, that's somehow that you can get to a carbon neutral version of biomass as a fuel source. So that's something to be wary of in terms of being touted as a natural solution. This was a great conversation. I think we're getting the hook, but thank you.
Thank you all.